Hey guys, I'm here to talk about terror management theory, which is one of the most influential theories in social psychology, and it is very important to my thesis. And at the end of this video, I'm going to talk briefly about what my thesis is about, because I will at long last feel comfortable talking about it at the end of this video. Although I do have one more video I'm going to do as sort of preparation for the video where I go in detail about my thesis. So today I'm talking about terror management theory. And this was first put forth by Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyszczynski, and Sheldon Solomon. And they posited, so this is an evolutionary theory of the origins and the function of culture. So they posited that humans, like all other animals, have an innate desire to survive and pass on their genes. However, unlike other animals, humans are aware that this struggle for survival that they go through every day is ultimately going to be futile and that they will one day die. They take the fact that other animals aren't aware of their own death as an assumption, which I have heard from many biologists. I don't know how you would know that, but that is an assumption of terror management theory. And so this tension between the fear of death, the knowledge of death, and the desire to survive causes anxiety for humans, or terror, if you will. And to relieve this anxiety, humans have come up with complex coping mechanisms to relieve that anxiety. And what this coping mechanism is, the authors argue, is the cultural worldview. And this is just, cultures, the American culture. It's also religion, Christianity, Islam, anything. Anything that gives the world meaning, that imposes some kind of narrative on the world, that makes people feel cosmically significant. And what they argue these cultural worldviews do is allow people to feel like they will attain, in some sense, some kind of immortality. And this can come in two forms. It can be literal immortality, like a Christian who subscribes to the Christian worldview. If he or she follows the Christian worldview, they will go to heaven and live forever. So that's literal immortality. And then symbolic immortality comes in sort of two forms. The more common one is that you invest heavily in your culture. So, for example, someone like me would invest heavily in America, and they will feel like, as an American, they're going to live forever because America will live forever as this glorious nation, as this glorious culture. Or they can feel like they will live on forever because they will attain some kind of achievement in the eyes of the culture. So if I'm an American, I can live forever by becoming this billionaire, a famous billionaire, and then my name will live on forever because the American cultural worldview values becoming a billionaire, so that will help me live forever by achieving that culturally valued thing. So they further argue, this allows humans to go about their daily lives largely able to ignore the fact that they're going to die. So, an American who's striving with the American worldview will just work toward their business or something, or toward promoting America in some sense. Not directly. I'm not saying everyone who is an American obviously is this hyper-nationalist, but in some sense they are. Or a Christian is striving to be a good Christian so that he or she can live forever in heaven. And so what that further leads to is a prediction, which is that when people are made aware of their death, when their death is brought to the fore in their consciousness, they should then do two things. I should defend their cultural worldview much more vigorously, because suddenly they're made aware of the fact that all of this that they're doing, all of their, investment in this cultural worldview and their religion, whatever, is going to be ultimately meaningless after they die, because everyone dies. So they will want to affirm that worldview even more than usual, because they will need to overcome the anxiety that comes from that awareness, and believe even more in the fact that they will be immortal because of this cultural worldview. And and 2, that they should be more hostile toward people from other cultural worldviews. So if I'm an American, the existence of a Canadian worldview, just hypothetically, just go with it, a Canadian worldview will be threatening because the fact that that exists implies that there's a chance that my American worldview is wrong, is not the best worldview, and therefore I won't go on living forever, either because I attain this great achievement or because my culture is the best in the world. Because it might not be the best in the world, because Canada's worldview might be better. So that is the crux, that is the biggest prediction to come out of terror management theory, and it's called the mortality salience hypothesis. Mortality salience, whether or not death is salience, so mortality salience. So when I refer to mortality salience, that's what I mean, being made aware of the fact that you're going to die. And hundreds of studies have been done since the first formulation of this theory that have supported this mortality salience hypothesis. I'm going to go through a couple studies, and I'm going to do one study about the vigorous affirmation of the worldview, and one study about the derogation of an outgroup of someone from another cultural worldview. So the first one, in the first study, they had participants, as their mortality salience manipulation, they had them write sort of a brief paragraph about death. They asked them, describe what will happen to your body as it decays and after you die. And they had them write like a small paragraph about this. And then in the control condition, in the other condition where they weren't aware of their death, they were asked to just write about the dentist. And then they had participants read an anecdote about a woman who was accused of being a prostitute. And then they had them rate how high a prison bond they think the woman should be given. So what this is that a prostitute is considered morally reprehensible by the American cultural worldview. This is taking place in America, this study. So maybe not as much today, but this was back in 1989. And so prostitution was considered by the culture to be morally reprehensible. So when they're made aware of their death, they should want to affirm that culture even more strongly. So they should give this prostitute a much higher prison bond than when they're not aware of their death. And that is what they found. The participants who wrote the essay about death gave the prostitute a much higher prison bond. And then another study about derogation of outgroups as opposed to affirmation of the cultural worldview was done in 1990 on Christian participants. And they had Christian participants do the same mortality salience manipulation, and then they had them read a description of a fictional Jewish student and a fictional Christian student. So the Christian student will be from your own cultural worldview. So under mortality salience, you should like them more and want to affiliate with them more and rate them more favorably, etc. But the Jewish student is from a rival cultural worldview, because the existence of Judaism as a worldview threatens the legitimacy of the Christian worldview. So the participants had the mortality salience manipulation, and then they rated the Jewish participant on whether they wanted to meet this participant, how much they kind of thought that they were approachable, and also on a number of traits that are kind of stereotypically associated with Jews, like being obnoxious and manipulative. And they rated the fictional Christian person also on these same variables. And again, they found that under mortality salience, these Christian participants wanted far less to associate with the Jewish person, associated much more stereotypes typically associated with Jews with that student. And the Christian participant, on the other hand, they rated as very likable, wanted to meet them, rated them as honest and reliable, more honest and reliable, and the Jewish student as more obnoxious and manipulative, just as two examples. So, and there have been hundreds of more studies done on this. I could have found any number of more studies supporting the mortality salience hypothesis, but obviously I don't want this video to go on forever. But one more addition to this theory, which is important to my thesis, And it's the idea that cultural worldviews can be individualized to an extent. So I might be an American, but to go with the prostitution example, I may not have as negative attitudes toward prostitution as some other person, even though prostitution is sort of a generally, considered a bad practice among the American cultural worldview. I might have thought about it and decided that I'm okay with it, whereas another person hasn't. And so, under mortality salience, I should then not really be my ratings of a prostitute should not be affected, whereas another person who hasn't had that same shift in their worldview will rate the prostitute less favorable. They will give the prostitute a greater prison bond. And so in a follow-up study to that study on the ratings of the prostitute I mentioned, they asked participants ahead of time about their attitudes toward prostitution. And so they had some students who were okay with prostitution, didn't think it was really morally reprehensible, and then another group who thought it was immoral and bad. And they found what it predicted. Under mortality salience, the group who thought prostitution was morally reprehensible gave the prostitute a higher prison bond than the other group. The other group was unaffected by the mortality salience manipulation. So there was the mortality salience manipulation and the writing about the dentist, and there was no difference between those two groups among the students who were okay with prostitution. So worldviews can be individualized in that sense. Okay, so that's a bit of a rundown of terror management theory. I'm going to talk a little bit about my thesis, because my thesis is about how mortality salience affects political attitudes. So there's also been many studies done on whether mortality salience makes people more politically conservative, or whether it makes liberals more liberal or conservatives more conservative. And there are studies suggesting both. So my thesis is an attempt to reconcile these findings, these disparate findings. Because the idea, from terror management theory, the idea that there is an individualized worldview should imply that one's political views are individualized. I'm a liberal, you might be a conservative, therefore, under mortality salience, I should become more liberal because that's my individualized worldview within the broader American cultural worldview. And if you're a conservative, then you should be more conservative under mortality salience because that's your individualized worldview as it's been sort of modified from the larger American cultural worldview. And there is findings suggesting that, and findings suggesting that both of us, no matter our political views, should just become more conservative under mortality salience. So, yeah, that is what my thesis is about. That's a very, very brief rundown. I have one more video I'm going to do before I talk about my thesis in depth. So, thank you for watching, guys. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I will try to remember to leave citations below. I'll leave a link to the videos on Ernest Becker below. Ernest Becker, terror management theory is heavily influenced by the work of an anthropologist named Ernest Becker, so I'm going to leave links to 2 videos about his work below. Don't need to watch them to understand this, obviously, but they're very interesting, I think. So yeah, thank you for watching, guys. Bye!